I really thought when I was preparing the worship materials for this week, and so I worked in advance on a lot of the materials for Lent and the calls to worship, etc. And I really thought that this was going to be the week that I would be talking about making amends, about making things right for what we've done in the past. Because that's what I thought the Zacchaeus story was about. But it turns out that's not what came to me as I was preaching this week. So this is a sermon about sight and blindness and restoration. I will be focusing both on the story about the blind man and the story of Zacchaeus, where Jesus engages with these two people along his journey to Jerusalem, where we get set up at the beginning with Jesus saying very clearly that he's on his way. We're getting closer and closer to the moment of the cross. And these are both, as I held these two stories together, I realized these are both stories about the restoration of sight, not for the blind man or for Zacchaeus, but for the crowd, for all the people who are watching, for all the people who are observing and listening in and following along with Jesus on the way. And potentially it's also about having the eyes of those for us as we join in that crowd, as we participate along with those people who are walking along, and having our eyes opened as well. We'll see, so to speak, if you're going to come along with me on that. Obviously, as we read a story about a blind man who receives sight, that one is literally about having his sight restored. He's not given a name, by the way, in this version of this story. This is a story that appears in other gospels as well. He's just called the blind man. So we know that's a very important part of who he is. But in Mark's version of the story, he's called Bartimaeus. So sometimes I'm going to use that name because I like a person to have a name, and then I can mix it up a little bit. Bartimaeus then, in a very important way, is the blind man who can then see. Pastor Brandon Grady is the pastor of a church in Bethlehem, not Bethlehem, Church of the Brethren. I saw Brethren and I read Bethlehem. He's a Church of the Brethren pastor in Pennsylvania, and he is totally blind. And he is obviously very familiar as a pastor with the ways that blindness is used in scripture, blindness and sight, both the symbolic ways and literal ways that people receive sight. And this is what he says about how he understands blindness. He says, the eye in all ways is the lamp of the body, but for me, it's the eye of the spirit. The eye that allows me to see beyond what the world sees in many aspects. I have found my eyes continually open, even as a totally blind person in ministry. The greatest blessing I've been given so far is God's gift of no vision. Like Pastor Brandon, Bartimaeus has a kind of sight that sighted people around him do not. When this blind man learns that Jesus is near, he senses or hears people talking around him about Jesus being near, Bartimaeus calls out to Jesus, Jesus, Son of David. He sees Jesus. And with this spiritual insight that Pastor Brandon is talking about, he sees Jesus and he calls out and identifies Jesus' connection to messiahship, to the line of David, and what all of that means in that cultural context. Even as the crowd around him is blind to this aspect of Jesus' identity, even as the crowd blocks him, tells him to leave Jesus alone, scolds him, this blind man is faithful and persistent, and he calls out again, Son of David, have mercy on me. And he's rewarded by Jesus' attention, and Jesus approaches and engages with him, and ultimately he literally has his sight restored. But not only that, by giving this man his sight, Jesus is restoring him to community, restoring him to the people who are around him. Then, in the story of Zacchaeus, it's also the crowd who has a blind spot. They're grumbling and complaining when Jesus chooses to invite Zacchaeus to his home, invite himself over to Zacchaeus' home for a meal. They cannot see Zacchaeus as worthy of Jesus' attention. They think that because he is rich, because he is a chief tax collector, he is the enemy. They have an idea about who he is and cannot see anything other than that. But here's the thing about Zacchaeus. First of all, he is supposedly a rich guy for whom one might think appearances are pretty important. That because of his status, it would be important to him to maintain a level of decorum. And yet here he is in this very undignified and childlike manner, running ahead of the crowd and hauling himself up in a tree so that he can see Jesus. I can very clearly remember as a child, in my grandparents' backyard, they had this huge birch tree. And it was a weeping birch. It had all of the leaves hanging down. And I loved climbing up in that tree because I could see everything in the backyard. I could spy on the adults. And I didn't think anyone could see me. They probably could, but I loved climbing up in the tree. And Zacchaeus was getting up in that tree to see Jesus, not because he was trying to get attention, not because he wanted Jesus to come to him, but he wanted to see Jesus. He did not have any expectation that Jesus would come to him. But if he did, you would think that the reaction he would expect was a wondering what the heck a grown man of his stature was doing up in a tree. And the second thing about Zacchaeus is that it is very possible to read this text not as if Zacchaeus was making amends of some kind, not like he had a big revelation because of this encounter with Jesus. It's possible to read this text as if all along he has already been practicing generous giving. He has already been making amends whenever he's been at fault. So he and Jesus are walking along and they stop within earshot of the crowd around them. And Zacchaeus says, "Lord, look, I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anyone, I repay them. I repay them 4 times as much." I give, he says, as in it's present tense, like I am already giving. Just like I could say, I give to Evergreen once a month and it just comes right out of my bank account. Like, this is what I am doing. They stop so that the crowd can hear this, and then Jesus responds to Zacchaeus, also in earshot of the crowd around them. This isn't like in private in Zacchaeus' home. He says, "Today's salvation has come to this household because he too is a son of Abraham. The human one came to seek and to save the lost." And with those words, Jesus has restored sight to the crowd and has restored Zacchaeus to his community, reminding them and him, you are a child of Abraham. You are one of these folks. No one needs to see Zacchaeus as the enemy anymore. Just like in the story about our learns to understand that his neighbor is not his enemy, that they can eat pie together and enjoy it. Zacchaeus is a son of God and he is a child of Abraham. Both Bartimaeus, the blind man, and Zacchaeus, the wealthy tax collector, are faithful and they could not be more different from each other. And yet both of those two are faithful and righteous, and it is the crowd who is blind and stumbling around and needing a reminder from Jesus to tell them about what wholeness looks like, what restoration looks like. And like the crowd, I think we need, or at least I need, I will just speak for myself. We need perspectives with people other than my own to open my eyes in the same way that the crowd had their eyes open. I probably said this before. I often like I hear the voice of my former colleague, Jonathan Neufeld, in my head saying, where you sit determines what you see. Or in this instant, what you perceive. where you sit determines what you perceive. Because I don't have a disability like blindness, I cannot see or perceive what that is truly like. I can't even really understand it fully as a metaphor, because I can close my eyes, but I'm a very visual person. I can still see behind my eyes. I can picture what the world is as if my eyes were open. I can't really even get that as a metaphor. So it was truly a gift this week, a gift of the Spirit, it almost felt like, to have received the Anabaptist Disabilities Network newsletter, which was all about blindness. Blindness and low sight. And that's where that quote from Pastor Brandon Grady came from that I highlighted earlier. He goes on to talk about blindness as a gift. He says, the greatest blessing I've been given so far is God's gift of no vision. It allows me to form lasting relationships, appreciate the depth of music, relish even the ordinary moments of working and ministering heart to heart with individuals in a wonderful variety of environments and unique circumstances. And he goes on to talk about the clarity he sometimes comes to in ministry, which he believes is because he is blind. In this, he is like Bartimaeus. Although, unlike him, Pastor Brandon doesn't experience his blindness as a barrier to community. As he expresses it, it potentially actually allows a greater depth of community and connection. In another article in that same newsletter, there is an interview with a young woman who's a teen. She's a member of her congregation. Her name's Eleanor Habecker, and she is a teenager who has been blind for her whole life. And she talks to the interviewer about her experience of being blind in her Christian community. And like Pastor Brandon, she has never experienced blindness as a barrier to connecting in her community. Her congregation, she says, sees her as a valued member of her community. I was really impressed actually with the way that Eleanor talked about specifically the way she experiences belonging in her youth group. She remembers her pastor asking her once, "Do you think that I once was blind and now I see is literal, or if it's about having really good accommodations?" This question and the way that Eleanor is able to experience her faith community fully is about a kind of wholeness that's possible because her community provides accommodations for her. Not because she needs to become sighted to belong, but because they've created a way for her to be included and find belonging. In fact, she says more than once in the interview, she doesn't think she would like to have her sight fully restored, that it would be too overwhelming and difficult to adapt if she was to experience that. And I have heard deaf people say too sometimes that when they get the cochlear implant that allows for hearing, they've chosen not to use that because it feels too untrue to who they are and also too overwhelming an experience in the world. The ways that creating accommodations and openings for people of all abilities to be fully in community, that reminded me as I was thinking about this of an episode of 99% Invisible, which is a podcast about design and architecture and the ways that we experience the world that we don't always see, that are just part of our experience of the world. This episode from a number of years ago, I went back and listened to it again because I think about it often and I wanted to get the details again. It's all about the history of curb cuts in sidewalks and what is now called the curb cut effect. So curb cuts are the places where, like they're lower so that people with different abilities can roll instead of step over the sidewalk. And so for those of us who don't need that little ramp from the sidewalk to the street, don't think too much about it. Either we just walk down that little slope, or if it's not there, we step onto the street. And I well and truly learned the difficulty of not having curb cuts when I was walking with an SMC member who has a motorized wheelchair. And we were this was in the COVID era when we were still meeting outside pretty frequently in summers. And he joined us on the bus, which was his mode of transportation. And I was walking back to find his bus stop with him. And most of the time we spent walking in the street because we were in a residential neighborhood. The only place that he could get up onto the sidewalk was driveways. And driveways are just meant to go right out into the street where those cars are going by. But the thing about curb cuts is that they're not only for people like Kent, who I was walking with. That's who they were meant, that's what they were made for, people with wheelchairs. But way back in the 1940s, after the First World War, when they were injured veterans, Kalamazoo, Michigan was one of the first places to install curb cuts. Kalamazoo, of all places. I guess because the curbs were quite high and they experienced because of flooding, so they really needed those cuts. So they installed those little ramps for the sake of injured soldiers. And afterward, the town commissioned a study. And I'm quoting the reporter from the podcast who said, it was the curb cut. It said the curb cuts not only helped people in wheelchairs and people who used crutches, but women, and it did say women, pushing strollers and delivery men with their deliveries and bicyclists. And I'm sure we can think of many other people who benefit from those. And then it kind of ended with something like, it was creating freedom of movement for everybody. Freedom of movement for everybody, for an accommodation that was meant for one category of folks. And that's been proven true over and over and over again, that when an accommodation is made for one specific need, like Kent in his wheelchair, it allows for greater freedom and inclusion for many others as well. And the reporter in the podcast goes on to cite a few examples, like closed captioning on TV, letting you follow a ball game in a noisy bar, or the automatic door opener when your arms are full of packages. And I have often thought about this in the context of church, and particularly when I was working with kids for children, that when we in church maybe explain something more fully for the sake of children to understand, or we put words on the wall instead of just written down so that people can experience that in a new way, that we create freedom of movement and greater inclusion for all people. When we have gluten-free and alcohol-free elements in communion so that everyone can participate in the same loaf and the same cup as one body. For me, this is what Jesus' ministry is an invitation toward, this kind of inclusion and restoration that sees the wholeness of the reign of God more than just as literal sight. It's the ability to see our way into welcome, to see our way into understanding that every person has a place at Jesus' table and in God's family. May it be so. Amen.